So let me kick off here. Just after I left Facebook last year, I got a phone call, and it came from one of Australia's media billionaires, and it wasn't one of these on the screen, but this was what was going on in the background. And he asked me to come in and have a meeting and catch up. I knew his son very well, but I'd never met him before. So we sat down and started talking about disruption and Facebook and digital media and Netflix and everything that was going on in his world. And he was asking me a lot of advice and questions about how he would run his business. And at one point I said to him, look, you know, if I'd come to you just 3 years ago and I said, give me your top 10 competitors, would Facebook have even been on the list? And he said, you wouldn't have been in my top 20. And yet, when we were having that conversation, and today, Google, Facebook, Netflix, you know, in different orders, are his number 1, number 2, and number 3 problems, his biggest competitors. And so just a few years, he admitted to me, he hadn't seen what was changing and how quickly it had changed, and he hadn't prepared his business for that change. And therefore, he'd lost a lot of the value that he'd built up over the decades that he was running that business. And he was a very successful, and is a very successful and disruptive business leader. But there was a second thing he admitted to me that was probably even more revealing. I pulled out my phone and I was talking about something relating to Facebook or Instagram, and he admitted to me, he said, you know, I've never looked at Facebook on a mobile phone. And yet, 14 million Australians every day did exactly that, his customers, his viewers. Yet he had never bothered to pick up a mobile phone and look at Facebook. And he was a bit ashamed to admit that to me. But that was a trend that I was seeing, not just from the media billionaires, but a trend I was seeing from directors and senior leaders, was that sort of lack of curiosity about what technology was doing to change customer experience and what it was doing to break down the boundaries of how businesses were operating. The shift in how media is consumed, driven by digital, has been tremendous. And that's just an example around media consumption. You can look at a lot of other technologies, and it's the same. The speed with which things are changing is just happening so fast. So that's the problem. The gap is opening up, at least on the consumer front around many digital technologies, and it's the same for lots of other technologies that are impacting business. I think the way to deal with it is probably, for boards to deal with it, is probably 2 or 3 things that they can do. So one is, you know, clearly have the right mix of talent on the board, and sometimes that means bringing new directors, maybe in some cases that maybe unconventional or maybe not, haven't considered before, bringing those onto the board to add a real-world experience about new technologies and disruption. I think the second is existing directors need to probably retool themselves a little bit, learn about the new technologies that are impacting their industry and their consumers, and get a lot closer to them. So that's either by doing courses or just getting a lot more curious or interacting with those businesses firsthand. And probably the third is, I think, just a mindset shift to being a lot faster and more curious and more just more kind of a greater urgency, I think, to how they address their own role as a director, and also how they address their business that they're charged with looking after. Bringing an urgency to that business so that you don't become too complacent and you turn up just to turn up to the meeting. I've got a couple other examples, little vignettes that happened just recently I thought I would share with you that help illustrate this as well. I was with one of Australia's largest retailers, and I was talking to their board, and their conversation was turning around what should we do about Amazon, and how would Facebook and Google and Amazon think about our business, and what are the things that you're doing in virtual reality and artificial intelligence. And I asked them at one point, I said, how many people do you have working on artificial intelligence voice assistants today, like Alexa or Google Home or Microsoft Cortana? And they admitted to me that they had 0. Not one person that was working on AI voice assistants today. Now, Amazon, the competitor that's come into the market, and their share price, this retailer's share price has dropped in part because of that entry. Amazon has over 2,000 people working on voice assistants for Alexa today. And that's just for Alexa. That doesn't count the AI people they have working on everything else that supports their web business. So on the one hand, we had an Australian retailer, 30% market share plus, that had nobody. On the other hand, we had a new entrant who's extremely catched up, who has over 2,000 people and 10 years of experience in this space. When you're up against a well-funded, fast-moving, digital native competitor who comes into your space, there's real challenges. It's not a simple answer. But it's probably 3 broad things I think companies can think about. So one is
the first is a lot of technologies, to an extent, are becoming more open source, and the applications of those technologies are more open source. So it's not a matter of just hiring a bunch of people to build it. You can actually hire a couple of people or outsource the development of something that builds on top of that technology. I'll give you an example. Facebook Messenger, which is Facebook's messaging platform. There's bots and AI-driven bots that you can now build on top of that platform, and Facebook makes that development kit available to any developer anywhere in the world. So now there's thousands of developers building bots for, including some of Australia's biggest businesses, building bots for Messenger, and some are doing it very well. So that's one. I think the second is, in terms of bringing talent into the business, the second is really thinking about the types of opportunities you can give that talent in order to bring the best talent in. So in other words, don't bring talent in that's used to a startup and fast-moving and agile environment and then stifle it with bureaucracy and red tape and too many gates to go through and slow progression. You need to create a more agile, fast-moving environment for those people. And I think the third is simply through alliances and through partnerships. You're not going to be able to hire everybody that you need, but you can probably solve some of that problem simply by putting in place smart alliances and smart partnerships with existing businesses that are trying to solve some of those problems with great talent themselves.
So while all this has been going on in my time at Facebook, which spanned 5 years, this is what was happening in the Facebook world. We started out back in 2012 with about 900 million users on our platform, and we only had one platform. We just had Facebook. And 900 million is a big number. But remember, Facebook started in 2004 when we had nobody. So from 2004 to 2012, we went to almost 1 billion people on one platform. But then in those subsequent 5 years, and if you look at the Channel 10 example, back in 2012, 2013, some of those folks were putting another $1 billion into Channel 10. Well, this is what we were doing at Facebook. We were building Facebook up, that platform alone, to over 2 billion users. Messenger, we spun out and took to over 1 billion users. We bought WhatsApp, and we grew that to over 1 billion users. We bought Instagram, and that's coming up on 1 billion. And if you add all these up, it's 5.1 billion people. Some of these are the same people. But this is how many people use Facebook services around the world. 5x increase in just 5 years. Now, the point isn't to say that Facebook's an amazing business, and it is, and I can talk more about that. But the point is to say the speed with which technology is changing the world is now faster than ever. And I firmly believe that that speed is now outstripping the ability of 20th century processes and organizational structures and boards to be able to deal with the speed of the 21st century. And that's the thing that we really need to solve.
When you're not inside a business, you don't see all the plumbing, and there's a lot to digital than just somebody's website or their mobile app. There's digitization of processes, there's digitization of how they do product development. There's all kinds of things you can't see from the outside. But just from what I see looking in, I think there's a few Australian businesses that have started to do digital, I think, well, and they're doing it in a way that's, that's becoming world class. And so one is the banks. I think the banks generally in Australia have pretty strong digital offerings. You can kind of critique bits and pieces, but their consumer digital offerings, I think, are pretty innovative. And so the whole banking sector, I think, in Australia sort of punches above its weight. I think the second would be, I look at airlines in Australia. I think Qantas is pretty progressive in how it thinks about digital, what it builds for consumers, and how it uses data. And it's thought about creating a data business that underpins its wider airline and digital business. And I think the third is, and it's one that gets overlooked, it's Domino's Pizza in Australia, which is one of the most, in my experience, one of the most mobile, digital, data-driven businesses I've ever seen in this country. And they've really rethought what it is to be a fast foods business. And they've really built inside they built a technology business that in some ways just happens to deliver pizzas. And I think that is a really exciting way to think about how you build a business for the digital future.
However you define digital, and I get asked to talk all the time about artificial intelligence and virtual reality and e-commerce, all the Internet of Things, blockchain. Just take all that stuff together, park it for the moment. What does all this digital stuff do? It profoundly changes 4 things. And the first and the most important is speed. The speed with which the world is changing. It took 40 years for there to be 50 million radios on Earth. It took 14 years for there to be 50 million TVs on Earth. It took 1 year for there to be 50 million Facebook accounts on Earth. It took 4 months for there to be 50 million WeChat accounts on Earth. In other words, the speed with which things can move now, because of the network effects of global platforms, because of the capital that's available, because of the computing power and the cloud and the speed of the internet, means that businesses can be built in such blinding fast speed that if we're an old-style business making decisions in old-style ways, it's not good enough for the future. Look at businesses like Uber that didn't even exist a few years ago, $70 billion in market cap. Look at businesses like Airbnb, same thing. Look at Netflix. You know, in 2010, Netflix, you know how much they spent on original content for their platform? Zero. Nothing. They didn't produce one piece of original content. That was just 8 years ago. This year, Netflix will spend over $8 billion on original content. That is more than any Hollywood studio. They will produce 88 feature films to put onto Netflix. That is more than any other Hollywood studio. The next biggest is Disney that will do 23. And they are spending more money producing more original content than almost all the Hollywood studios combined. And they've only been doing it for 8 years. Hollywood studios have been at it for 100 years. Wow, where did Netflix come from? So that's the speed issue. The second is boundaries. And this is around the competitive boundaries that sit around your industry and your business that all of us think are kind of carved in stone. They are really starting to melt away. And you can look at example after example. Look at the hotel business and what Airbnb has done to compete with them. Look at the car business, the taxi business, and even the automotive industry and how autonomous vehicles or Uber is starting to disrupt them. Look what Facebook has done to traditional media. Look what YouTube has done to television viewing and Netflix has done to television or linear television viewing. You can look at industry after industry and see boundaries being broken down or redefined. And that's a good thing because it gives new opportunities, but it's a challenging thing because it brings new threats.
You know, everybody has an app now. Everybody's gone mobile to an extent, and that's kind of table stakes at this point in time. I think the next generation for certain businesses is probably would come down to 3 things I think that would impact almost every business. So one is artificial intelligence, big data, data analytics, that space. So the ability to harness large amounts of data to create value for consumers and to drive your business better. That's a hugely disruptive space that every business is going to have to get their brains around and how AI is going to play into their future. I think the second for particularly businesses that are dependent on human interaction is going to be virtual reality and augmented reality that are going to create new opportunities for businesses to create value for consumers. So, you know, Facebook alone has put a few $1 billion into virtual reality because they see that as a disruption of essentially the iPhone. Eventually, social media will move from a touchscreen to a virtual world that you experience more immersively. And then probably the third is the Internet of Things, which it's been a little forgotten in some of the rush to talk about blockchain and other things. But the Internet of Things, if you just want to take a simple description of it, is that within a couple of years, by 2020, I think the number is there'll be 30 billion assets connected to the internet. That's human beings and devices. 30 billion. And the amount of data that will throw off and the amount of insight that can drive for every business on Earth, I think is really exciting. So how that Internet of Things plays into any business, I think is something they need to focus on.
Every business, and I think every board, needs to revisit what's the culture you need to build to be successful in the future. We could have a whole hour on this topic itself. What do you need to do to be more nimble, more agile, more adaptive, be bigger at risk-taking? What are all those things you need to put in place? And then what's the talent you need to bring in to make that happen? And how does that talent need to be incentivized, deployed, inspired, et cetera?